Hi guys, today we're going to start the chapter on the integumentary system. The first couple slides, you guys will see your list of objectives. These are the things that you guys should learn from the chapter. All right, so the whole chapter is on the integumentary system. The integumentary system includes the integument. The integument is like a fancy way of saying the skin or cutaneous membrane. So when we look at the integumentary system includes the skin as the major organ, and then there are various accessory structures that are associated with the skin. So this is stuff like the hair, which grows from the skin, the nails, various types of glands that make secretions for the skin, like sweat glands or sebaceous, oil-producing glands. All of these things are included in the integumentary system. So I told you guys that the main component of the integumentary system is the skin. And the technical term for the skin is the cutaneous membrane. Now, technically, there are two parts or two components to the cutaneous membrane. There's the epidermis and the dermis. The epidermis is the outermost layer. This is the superficial layer that you can see and feel and touch. So you're looking at my epidermis right now. The deeper layer that's underneath the epidermis, so the inner layer of the skin, is called the dermis. So you see that those terms are kind of similar to each other, right? Dermis, epidermis. This term or this prefix epi means upon. So epidermis literally means upon the dermis, and that's where it is. The epidermis sits right upon the dermis, right on top of the dermis. Now, we sometimes describe the epidermis, this outer layer, as a superficial epithelium. Superficial because it's superficial. It's like the most superficial part of the body, the outermost part of the body. And it is an epithelium, a layer that's made out of epithelial tissue. So think back to the tissues lab that we did. There are a few things that should be kind of standing out in your head right now in regard to epithelial tissue, right? One, epithelial tissue is a lining tissue. So it's always lining an open surface, right? So like lining the inside of the mouth is epithelial tissue. Lining our blood vessels, epithelial tissue. Lining the outer surface of our body, epithelial tissue, right? This is like the ultimate surface, is the surface of the body. So the epidermis, this outer layer, is made out of epithelial tissue, which is a lining tissue. It is also what we call avascular. And what does avascular mean? Hopefully you're saying it means no blood vessels. We'll talk about this more in a little bit, but this epidermis, the outer layer of the skin, is avascular. There are no blood vessels present in it. Also, it has a high degree of cellularity. High cellularity, what that means is that the cells are jam-packed very, very closely to each other. There's not extracellular space or extracellular fluid. When we look at the epidermis, we'll see, cell, and then cell, and then cell. And the cells are right up against each other like this. And they layer on top of each other, right? And they're held very, very closely together. Now that's important because, again, it's a lining tissue. It lines an open surface. So in order for it to be a good barrier, the cells have to be very closely packed together. Imagine if you had like a cell over here, and then there was some liquid, right? And then a cell over here, and then some liquid. that's not a barrier, right? Anything that wanted to come in or out of the body would just go straight through that liquid. The liquid would actually not even stay there, it would just seep. So that would not be a good barrier. So epithelial tissue, like we have in the dermis, has high cellularity. The cells are packed very, very closely together. All right, so that's the epidermis, the outermost layer. The deeper part of the skin is called the dermis. Okay, now the dermis is made out of a different type of tissue. The dermis is made out of connective tissue. Remember, connective tissue has cells kind of scattered all around, and then it has a lot of protein fibers present. Right? It has an extracellular matrix or stuff outside of the cells. And this connective tissue happens to have a lot of collagen and elastic fibers present in the extracellular matrix. We'll talk about that in a little bit. One thing to keep in mind for connective tissue is that it's vascular. Right? And vascular means that there is a direct blood supply. Right? There are blood vessels present in the tissue. Technically, those two layers are the skin. That's it. So technically, the cutaneous membrane or skin just includes the epidermis and the dermis. When we study the skin, though, we frequently study the region that's just underneath the skin at the same time. And we refer to that area just underneath the skin as the hypodermis. This prefix hypo, we use that very, very commonly, hypo and hyper, so you should know these. But hypo means below, and then hyper means above. So hypodermis literally means below the dermis, and that's exactly where this is. The hypodermis is the area that's just deep to the dermis or just beneath the dermis. This is also an area of connective tissue, loose connective tissue. Specifically in the hypodermis, we see a lot of adipose tissue. Right? And hopefully you guys know by now that adipose tissue is fat. So this is where we store our extra fat. Is in the hypodermis, just underneath the dermis, just underneath the skin. This is why if we eat a lot of extra fat that we're not using, we're not burning, and we have to start storing it, we start to see a change in the shape of our body because the area right underneath the skin starts to get larger and larger and larger as it stores more and more fat. This area, the hypodermis, again, it's not technically the skin, but we study it now because it's really closely associated. It's actually hard to draw an exact line and see where the dermis stops and where the hypodermis begins. It's kind of a blurred line between the two layers. So we'll study it now, even though it's not technically part of the skin. The hypodermis we also refer to as subcutaneous. So you could say like this is the subcutaneous layer, or if you're putting something there, you could say you're like medications. We inject some medications into the hypodermis, and we say that we're giving them subcutaneously, right? Because we're putting them in the subcutaneous area. Insulin, for example, when people give insulin, they kind of pinch up the skin a little bit and inject it into that fat. Well, that fat is in the subcutaneous region. The reason we call this subcutaneous is sub is like beneath, and cutaneous, well, we said that the skin is called the cutaneous membrane. So subcutaneous is telling us beneath the skin. Right? Think of the subway, right? Like in New York City, the subway goes under the ground, right? It goes beneath the surface. So subcutaneous is beneath the skin. All right, so the integumentary system, again, we said includes the cutaneous membrane or skin, which we just overviewed, and then it also includes various accessory structures. These accessory structures are just structures that originate from the skin. So they're very closely associated with the skin itself. These accessory structures will originate in the dermis. So we see that they're, the majority of them, most of these are anchored down in the dermis, the deep region of the skin. Some of them will extend up through the epidermis to the skin surface, and some will actually even extend past the skin surface. So hair, for example, right? The hair originates down in the dermis, and then it goes up through the epidermis, and then it continues past the surface of the skin. The same thing with the nails. Nails are accessory structures that extend past the surface of our skin. There are also numerous exocrine glands that are included in the accessory structures of this integumentary system. A gland is just something that makes a secretion, and we have endocrine glands and exocrine glands. Endocrine glands, you guys will learn about in A&P 2 when we do the endocrine system. Those are the ones that make hormones. Exocrine glands are different. Exocrine glands make secretions that get released onto some sort of a surface. So, for example, like mucus glands that release mucus onto the surface of the respiratory tract. Those are exocrine. Or the glands in your stomach that make stomach acid and release it into the stomach. Well, that's the surface of the stomach, right? Those are exocrine glands. Well, we have multiple exocrine glands that make secretions that get released onto the skin's surface. So those are included in the integumentary system. So these include things like sweat glands. They're technically called sudoriferous glands, but sweat glands, which there are two different types. You guys should have already learned this in lab, but there are eccrine sweat glands and apocrine sweat glands. And then there are also sebaceous glands. Those are oil-producing glands. Also included in the integumentary system are what we call suraminous glands. Suraminous. They make suramin. Suramin is just earwax, and that gets released under the skin surface in the ear to protect the eardrum. Right? So all of these things are considered accessory structures that are part of the integumentary system. Here you guys see the overall kind of gist, everything that's included in the integumentary system. We said the major organ of the integumentary system is the cutaneous membrane, or the skin. And the skin includes two layers, the epidermis and the dermis. The epidermis is from the curvy line up, right? It's the outer layer, the top layer. And if you look at this picture here, you'll notice this really kind of like, it's a very distinct curvy line, right? From that curvy line up is the epidermis. Below that curvy line is the dermis, right? The deeper layer of the skin. We actually break the epidermis up into multiple layers, and we break the dermis up into multiple layers. We're not going to worry about those right now, so you don't have to worry about the papillary and reticular layer. We'll look at those a little bit later. For right now, you see the epidermis up top up here, and then the dermis is this region below. Remember, we said we'll also look at the hypodermis, the area below the dermis. That's all of this region right here, the bottom. One easy way to identify the hypodermis is that it's the area that has a lot of fat tissue, right? Which we also called adipose tissue. You guys should know the other term for hypodermis, remember, is subcutaneous. Right, that's the subcutaneous layer or subcutaneous region. And then over on the other side of the picture, we have a lot of our accessory structures. Now, one thing I do want you guys to notice is the blood flow. The blood is coming into the skin via arteries. So these red vessels that you see here bring blood in to the tissue. And then the veins are shown in blue. They bring the old, used up, deoxygenated blood out of the tissue. Notice that these red vessels, these arteries, bring blood in through the hypodermis, right? They break off, they branch, and they spread out through the dermis. And you'll notice that the blood vessels come right up here to the very top of the dermis. And then they turn into veins, the blue ones, and they go back out again, right? They go down and they leave. So the blood flows all the way up to the very top of the dermis, and then it stops. Right? You'll notice those blood vessels do not enter into the epidermis. So this area up here at the top, it does not have any of those blood vessels present, because remember, we said that the epidermis is avascular. No vessels. Again, we mentioned that there are numerous different accessory structures. You see the hair. Oops. You see many hairs here. The hair actually comes down. It's anchored all the way deep down in the dermis, and then it extends out past the surface. You'll notice the hair is surrounded by a hair follicle. Right? This casing around the outside of the hair is the hair follicle. There are a bunch of different glands. So sebaceous glands, which you see right here, that's an oil gland. There are sweat glands, which you see right here, and then they have these little tubes or ducts, and they open up on the surface of the skin, and a pore. Also listed over here are some different sensory receptors. So the lamellated corpuscle, which is a Pacinian corpuscle. And then tactile corpuscles, right? So up here, down here, you guys learned to identify those already in lab. Remember, those are sensory receptors. When they're squished or triggered, they send a signal up this nerve fiber, and that signal makes its way up to the central nervous system, and then we know that we're touching something. The skin has numerous functions. The most obvious of these is probably protection, right? It provides protection of the underlying tissues and organs from both physical and chemical attacks or injuries. So physical stuff, for example, you can scratch at something, you can bump into something, you can dry off with a towel, and it doesn't hurt the tissues underneath. If you didn't have your skin, which your skin is pretty strong, if you didn't have your skin and you just roughly rubbed a towel up against your tissue, your adipose tissue underneath, you would destroy the tissue. So your skin provides that physical protection. And then also chemical protection. The skin's a really good barrier. So you can touch, chemicals or pathogens, bacteria, and they don't just enter into your body because the skin is a really, really good barrier. You can wash dishes and the soap doesn't just enter into you. So it protects you from chemicals. The integumentary system also allows for excretion. Excretion is getting rid of. It's pushing things out of the body. We can excrete excess salts in water. The sweat is really salty, so we can excrete extra salts in our sweat, as well as some organic wastes. You can actually metabolize or process some chemicals in your integumentary system and get rid of them via your glands. A couple examples of things that are excreted, wastes that are excreted via the skin, include garlic. If you've ever eaten a really garlicky meal and you feel like you just smell like garlic, you feel like it's kind of seeping out of you, that's because it can actually be processed and gotten rid of via your pores. Another one is alcohol. After somebody drinks a lot, it has to be a lot, but a lot of alcohol, it can actually start getting metabolized and processed by the integumentary system. So when someone feels like they're like sweating out the alcohol, that is true. They are actually sweating out the alcohol. The integumentary system is important in the maintenance of body temperature. So it allows us or helps us to keep a stable homeostatic body temperature. And it does this in a couple ways. One, it provides insulation, and really specifically the hypodermis, because of all of the fat tissue, it provides the most insulation. But it provides insulation to help keep the warmth inside. And then also evaporative cooling. So that means when we sweat and we release the sweat onto our skin surface, as that sweat evaporates, it cools the body down. So the integumentary system is really important in cooling the body when it gets too warm. The integumentary system is important in that it produces a pigment called melanin. Melanin is what gives the skin anywhere from like a yellowish to a tannish to a brownish to a blackish color. So melanin is what gives our skin its major natural color. And melanin also provides UV protection. So it protects us from the harmful radiation that comes from the sun. The integumentary system is also important in the production of another protein called keratin. Keratin is the protein that makes our skin strong. Same thing like keratin's in our hair and in our nails, and it makes these structures strong. Keratin protects from abrasion, which is like scratching and tearing. And it also protects us from too much water loss. Keratin is water resistant, so water doesn't want to cross it. That's one of the reasons why the skin is such a good barrier, why we're able to keep all of this water inside our body without it easily evaporating. That's because the skin has a ton of keratin. The integumentary system is where we produce vitamin D3. We get vitamin D from our diet, so we can eat vitamin D, but we produce vitamin D in the epidermis as well. And vitamin D3 is important for calcium absorption. We store lipids, mostly triglycerides, get stored in the integumentary system, really in the hypodermis. And then finally, the integumentary system has numerous touch receptors that are scattered throughout the skin. And these receptors allow us to sense all of our what are called somatosenses or somatosensory information. So that's like everything except the special senses. The special senses are vision, hearing, taste, all of this stuff like in the special organs of the head. The somatosenses are body senses like touch. So touch, pressure, vibration, texture, pain, temperature, all of the things that you can sense when something touches your body. Those are somatosenses or body senses. And we can sense these things because of sensory receptors that are scattered throughout the skin, throughout the integumentary system. So that's our overview, right? You have an overall gist or view of the integumentary system now. Now what we're going to do is we're going to go through each segment in a ton of detail, starting with the epidermis. So we'll cover all of the, or probably cover all of the epidermis in today's lecture. The epidermis, you guys already know, is the outermost layer, right? The most superficial layer of the skin. You guys know that it's made out of epithelial tissue, which we'll talk about in a second. When we look at the epidermis is jam-packed with cells. It has tons of cells. It can have like over 100 layers of cells, all packed very, very closely together. The most abundant cells, or most of the cells that we see in the epidermis, are called keratinocytes. Now this suffix oocyte means cell. Actually, that's the word root, but oocyte means cell. So this word is literally telling us keratin cell. And that's what keratinocytes are. They are cells that produce and store huge amounts of keratin. Again, keratin is a protein that makes the skin strong and water resistant. So most of the epidermis has keratinocytes. They're cells that make and store a ton of keratin. Now, when we look at the epidermis, we see that these keratinocytes, or these cells, are arranged in layers. Because the cells change a lot from the bottom of the epidermis to the top of the epidermis, we can take the epidermis and split it up into different areas because the cells look different at each area as we go up. And the epidermis has either 4 or 5 layers depending on what kind of skin. And we looked at these in lab, so this should be review for you guys. We have 2 different types of skin, thin skin and thick skin. Thin skin is the skin that covers most of our body, right? This is the skin that, like you see on your arms, your chest, your stomach, your back, your legs, your face. This skin has hair present in it. Even if it's really light, delicate hair, there is hair present in thin skin. And again, it covers most of the body. When we look at the epidermis, the outer layer of thin skin, we see that the cells are arranged in 4 layers. Also, the outermost layer, which is called the stratum corneum, is relatively thin, hence it's thin skin, right? So the stratum corneum, again, is the outer layer or outer part of the epidermis. And it's relatively thin in thin skin. Thick skin is on the palms of your hands and the soles of your feet. And touch that skin, right? Look at the skin on your hands. It feels very different than the skin on your forearm, right? The skin on your forearm is probably a lot more delicate. It's smooth, it's soft. Again, it has little tiny hairs present. The skin on your hands is probably thicker, stronger, more callousy. There are no hairs present in thick skin, so you will not find any tiny hair on the palm of your hands or the soles of your feet. When we look at this thick skin on our hands and our feet, we see that the epidermis has 5 layers. So there's 1 extra layer present in the epidermis of thick skin. If you guys remember from lab, what's that called? The extra layer that's present is called the stratum lucidum. I'm just writing S for stratum. Stratum just means layer, so all of the layers are going to start with stratum. So stratum basale, stratum spinosum, stratum granulosum. Stratum just means layer. So the extra layer that's present in thick skin is called the stratum lucidum. So there's an extra layer in the epidermis, and the outermost layer, the stratum corneum, is really thick. Hey, the stratum corneum of thin skin has like 30 layers of cells. The stratum corneum of thick skin has over 100. So it's like 3 or 4 times as thick in thick skin. All right, so the epidermis is jam-packed with cells. Most of those cells are called keratinocytes. The epidermis has these keratinocytes arranged in 4 or 5 layers, depending on the type of skin. The epidermis is also avascular, right? Remember, avascular means that there are no blood vessels present. It does not have blood running through it. Now, this creates a challenge. If we have living, functioning cells, which we do in part of the epidermis, how are they living and functioning if there's no blood supply? Okay, we'll talk about that in just 1 second. The epidermis is an avascular, and we said it's epithelial tissue, right? It's an epithelium. It's lining an open surface. Specifically, it is a stratified squamous epithelium. Think back to tissues, right? What does that mean? What is that telling us? Stratified is telling us that there are many layers. Squamous is telling us flat cells. Now remember, this cell shape is referring to the shape of the cells on the very top. Okay, so like I said, when we look at the epidermis, the cells change a lot from the bottom to the top. And on the bottom of the epidermis, they're actually pretty round. They're not really flat cells. They're pretty round cells. They're dividing, they're functioning, they've got a nucleus. They're like good normal cells. But as the cells move up towards the top of the epidermis, they start to get squished and flattened out. So by the time we're at the top of the epidermis, the cells are very flat. That's why we call them squamous. Okay? So the epidermis is a stratified squamous epithelium, right? It's a layer of tissue with a lot of an area with a lot of layers of flat cells. Now, let's talk about this avascular thing. So see, this is my skin, and you guys know that the epidermis is from the curvy line up, right? So all this area at the top, that's the epidermis. The epidermis has living cells in it at the bottom. The top is just dead skin cells, but the bottom of the epidermis, so like down here, these cells are living, functioning, dividing cells. So that means that they need oxygen to be delivered to them. They need carbon dioxide and wastes to be carried away. They need nutrients like glucose to be delivered to them. And the way that this good stuff normally gets to our cells is via the blood, right? The blood delivers. So we have this problem, right? Remember, blood vessels come in and they branch and they go all the way up to the top of the dermis, and then they curve and they go and they leave again. So the blood vessels never actually enter the epidermis. However, the cells at the bottom of the epidermis can still be living. And the reason for that is diffusion. Remember, diffusion is when things spread out, when they go from areas of high concentration to areas of low concentration. So up here at the top of the dermis, in these areas up here where the blood vessels stop, the blood drops off a bunch of good stuff. It'll drop off oxygen and glucose and fats and all this good stuff. that good stuff does not stay just clumped up in one little area. It spreads out, right? It diffuses. So it can diffuse up into the epidermis. That means that the cells at the bottom of the epidermis are close enough to those blood vessels. They're close enough to the dermis so that they can still be living, right? They can still be alive. However, diffusion only goes so far. So that means that the cells on the surface of the epidermis, the ones that are really far from the dermis, so they're really far from the blood supply, they're dead cells. So all of this up here at the top of the epidermis, these are just too far away from the blood. They don't have access to the blood. So those are completely dead cells. Essentially, they're just sacks of keratin at that point. Right? That's why you can scratch at your skin, right? If you scratch like that, you've got a ton of dead cells underneath your nails, and it's fine, right? It doesn't hurt, it's okay. You lose dead skin cells all the time. Now, it's important that the epidermis is avascular, right? It's important that the blood vessels stop down here in the dermis because you need a little bit of protection above those blood vessels. Imagine if the blood vessels came all the way up here to the top of the epidermis, right? If we had blood vessels just on the outside of our skin everywhere, it'd be kind of creepy, but it would also be terrible. We would bleed all the time, right? Blood vessels are really delicate. So, especially the tiny little ones. So anytime you scratched or bumped into anything or changed your clothes or someone, grabbed your arm, you would bleed all the time. So we need a little bit of padding, a little bit of insulation on top of our blood vessels. That's why the blood vessels are down here in the dermis and why we don't have any out in the epidermis. Okay, here you guys see the 5 strata, right, or the 5 layers of keratinocytes, the 5 layers of cells in thick skin, right, or in skin in general, so in the epidermis. Now, there's a few kind of terms here, a little bit of terminology that I want to remind you of. So this is the skin, right? The epidermis is from the curvy line up, right? So say that that's the epidermis. Remember that epithelial tissue, this lining tissue, so the epidermis, has 2 surfaces. It's got the deep surface that's down by the tissue underneath, and then it has the top surface that's free, that's lining the open edge. And we refer to those as the basal surface and the apical surface. So the basal surface is like the bottom. That's the deepest part. So that's like this end of the epidermis. And the apical surface is the open, the free side. So this top is the apical surface. Okay, that's the terminology we learned when we did the tissues chapter in lab. Now also this term basal lamina, right? Or also for basal lamina, we frequently will see the term basement membrane. The basal lamina or basement membrane is this like this thin layer of connection right here at the very bottom that connects the epithelial tissue up here to the connective tissue underneath, right? Because there's this layer where you've got the 2 different types of tissues coming together. So the line of proteins that are connecting them, that area is referred to as the basal lamina or the basement membrane. All right, so that's the kind of terminology there. Now, again, you guys see the 5 layers listed, and they're listed in order from the bottom up to the top, right? So from the basal surface out to the apical surface. So the bottom, right, or deepest layer of the epidermis is the stratum basale, right? Like base, bottom, basale. And it's full of basal cells, we'll see in a second. And the rest of this should be really familiar from lab, right? We have the stratum basale, and then just above that, the stratum spinosum. Above that is the stratum granulosum. Then the stratum lucidum, which is an area of really, really dense proteins. And then finally, the top or most superficial layer is the stratum corneum. The acronym that I told you guys in lab to remember these is boys say girls love clothes. I do. Boys say girls love clothes. Okay, make up whatever saying you want, but this is how you can memorize the layers from the bottom to the top. Now remember the stratum lucidum. I have this highlighted here because that is only in thick skin, right? It is not present in thin skin. So if this was thin skin that we were looking at, you would just cross that out and it would go straight from the stratum granulosum out to the stratum corneum. Here you guys see this is an actual micrograph. This is an actual picture from a microscope. So this is real skin. This is actually what your skin looks like. This is the curvy line here that separates the dermis from the epidermis. You'll notice out here in the epidermis how closely the cells are packed together. So when you look at this, like this is one cell, and then the dark purple in the middle, that's showing you the nucleus of the cell, and then the light area around it is the cytoplasm. So you'll see like these nuclei are really close together, right? The cells are jam-packed right up against each other, one after the next after the next. So that's a really high degree of cellularity. The cells are packed very closely together. If you look down below in the dermis, the cells are just scattered, right? Like there's a cell here, and then there's one over here, then there's one here, and then there's all this stuff outside the cell, right? All these pink little lines are showing us that there's a bunch of collagen that's present, but the cells are really scattered. So that's kind of how I can easily see the difference between the connective tissue of the dermis and then the epithelial tissue of the epidermis. And as always, I tell you guys, it's kind of easy to see from the curvy line up is the epidermis. So looking at the epidermis, we have our layers from the bottom to the top. The bottom layer, the first layer, is the stratum basale. So that's just this one single layer of cells. Then the stratum spinosum, there's a few layers of cells. Then the stratum granulosum, then the stratum lucidum, and then the stratum corneum. You see is this real thick area here. So if I asked you guys, what type of skin is this? Is this thick skin or is this thin skin? You should really easily be able to tell me this is thick skin. And there's a few reasons for that. One, the stratum corneum, this outer layer, is super thick. If this was thin skin, it would be like right here, much thinner. So there are a ton of these dead skin cells sloughing off here in the stratum corneum. Also, the other thing that's like a surefire way for you to know is that the stratum lucidum is present. If there was no stratum lucidum, it would be thin skin, but there is a stratum lucidum, so that means that this is thick skin. We're going to go through each of the layers of the epidermis in detail. Again, I mentioned to you guys that the cells change quite a bit from the bottom of the epidermis up to the top of the epidermis. And you guys could see that in the picture, right? The bottom, you see defined cells. You see a nucleus, like there are good, normal, functioning, living cells. And then when you looked at the very top of the picture, you didn't even see cells, right? It didn't look like there was any cells. There's no detail. It's just these like fibers, essentially, that you see. So that's a huge difference. The cells change a lot from the bottom to the top. So we're going to talk through each of the layers of the epidermis, and you'll kind of see what's happening in each layer and how the cell is changing in each layer. The stratum basale is, once again, the deepest layer of the epidermis. It's at the bottom of the epidermis, and it's attached to the basement membrane, which remembers the connection between the two layers, the epidermis and the dermis. The stratum basale, the bottom of the epidermis, is attached to the basement membrane by numerous hemidesmosomes. Okay, hemidesmosomes, hemi means half, and what a desmosome is it's like a little protein connector. I think of it like a staple. Okay, so we have this curvy line, right? And that curvy line we'll say is the basement membrane. And then we have our basal cells, right? Our cells that are present in the stratum basale. And we want them to be firmly attached, right? We don't want the layers to separate from each other and create little bubbles. We want them to be really strongly attached to each other. So we need some way to hook it in, right? To attach those cells to the basement membrane. We do that with hemidesmosomes. Again, think of it as just a staple. It's like a little protein staple that connects to the plasma membrane and the basement membrane. And it holds this together like this. That allows for a strong attachment. It strengthens the bond between the epidermis and the dermis. Now, the stratum basale is not a flat layer, right? I always talk about the curvy line, right? From the curvy line up. So instead of being flat, the stratum basale has these little fingers, these little extensions that go down into the dermis or towards the dermis. Those are called epidermal ridges, right? So each of these little curves that go down towards the dermis is an epidermal ridge. Now, the dermis, right, underneath, remember, forms dermal papilla that extend up like this in between the epidermal ridges. So the epidermal ridges and the dermal papilla interlink with each other like this. And that curvy line increases the surface area of the basement membrane. So it increases the surface area between the epidermis and the dermis. Now, this is important because it strengthens the bond between the two layers. We don't want the layers to separate. When they do, so like sometimes if you rub and rub and rub on the skin, you can separate the epidermis from the dermis and fluid accumulates there. That's what a blister is. So when you get a blister, you've separated the two layers from each other and all the fluid accumulates and that hurts, right? There's pressure on your pain receptors and it hurts. And then eventually the epidermis, the skin of the epidermis normally breaks when the blister pops and that skin comes off. And then that's when the blister is open and raw. So you don't want that to happen. So we want a really strong attachment between the epidermis and the dermis. Having these epidermal ridges, right, having the curvy line increases the amount of area between the two layers, and increasing the surface area increases the number of hemidesmosomes that you can have. More hemidesmosomes, right? More staples, stronger attachment. This also happens to create your fingerprints. So everybody has their own specific pattern of epidermal ridges. And the pattern of your epidermal ridges creates the actual little ridges on your fingers, your palms, your hands, your feet, right? We all have our own little pattern of what we call fingerprints. Those come from your specific pattern of epidermal ridges. Finally, the stratum basale is made out of numerous basal cells. Right, that's where this term is coming from. The stratum basale has basal cells. Basal cells are highly specialized cells. They're what we call germinative cells because they constantly germinate. What we mean by that is that the cells divide constantly. And they do this to replenish the dead skin cells that are lost, right? So the cells down here at the bottom, these basal cells divide. So one cell becomes two, right? And one of them stays down here to keep dividing. The other cell gets pushed up. And then the cell divides again, and the cells get pushed up and up and up. And eventually, as the cells make their way up towards the surface of the epidermis, they become dead skin cells and we lose them, right? I said, like, when you scratch, when you dry off, when you change your clothes, you're always losing dead skin cells. Well, you have to replace them, right? If all we did was lose cells and we didn't replace them, we wouldn't have skin left, right? The skin would have holes and ulcers in it. So we constantly have to be making new cells to replace the ones that we lose. We do that down in the stratum basale and the spinosum, we'll see in a second, right? But these basal cells in the stratum basale, that is their job, is to divide, right? So they constantly make new cells. Now, most of the cells in the stratum basale are basal cells that divide, but we do have a couple types of special cells that are scattered throughout the stratum basale. These include Merkel cells and melanocytes. Merkel cells are they're specialized cells that respond to touch. So they are touch receptors. They are touch receptors, and when they're stimulated, they send a message along a nerve and they trigger the nervous system to tell us that we're touching something. Now, these Merkel cells, these specialized touch receptors, are found in hairless skin on the palms of our hands and the soles of our feet. You remember we said that the palms of our hands and the soles of our feet are the areas where we have skin that doesn't have hair, right? Everywhere else, almost everywhere else, our skin has hair on it. There are a few exceptions. We'll talk about this when we do the accessory structures, but like the labia minora, which are external genitalia on the female, parts of the penis in the male, the eye, those areas don't have hair either, but most of your thin skin has hair present. But the palms of the hands and the soles of the feet, there is no hair present. And in these, in this stratum basale on the hands and the feet, we have Merkel cells. So additional touch receptors in addition to the other ones that we have down in the dermis. So that means that the palms of the hands and the soles of the feet are extra sensitive to touch. And this makes sense, right? Like, our hands and our feet are tools. We use our hands for numerous different activities, so they need to be sensitive to touch. All right, so the stratum basale has mostly basal cells, but then there are some Merkel cells if we're looking at the hands or the feet, and then the stratum basale in all areas has melanocytes. I told you guys already that oocyte means cell. So this term melanocyte is telling us that it's a melanin cell. And that's exactly what melanocytes are. They are cells that not just contain, but add on here, produce. Right? They produce the pigment melanin. I told you guys before that melanin is responsible for the pigment of our skin. There's all different shades of melanin. So it could be a brown pigment. It could be kind of a yellowish or a tan. It could be like a blackish pigment. But these melanocytes that produce and release melanin are responsible for the color of our skin. This melanin also protects the body from the sun's radiation, so from UV radiation. Melanocytes, the cell body, the major part of the cell is located down in the stratum basale, but it has processes or like little arms that reach up and out into the more superficial layers of the epidermis. So the cell, it looks kind of like an octopus. Like it has this body like this, but then it has arms that reach up and out so that it can make melanin, and then it'll release it kind of up and all out so that the melanin gets scattered throughout the epidermis. Now, if you guys have ever heard of this skin cancer, melanoma, melanoma is a skin cancer that starts or that originates in melanocytes. Now, there are multiple different types of skin cancers, and I'll kind of point out a few of them as we go through the chapter. But there are different types of skin cancers because there are different types of cells. So depending on what cell it is that becomes cancerous, you can have different cancers that result. So melanocytes are actually helpful. They typically help to prevent skin cancers because they protect from the sun's radiation. However, if the melanocyte itself gets beat with too much radiation, it can turn into a cancer. It can become cancerous. And in that case, we classify the skin cancer as a melanoma. All right, so we're moving up through the epidermis. We started with the stratum basale, and then up after the stratum basale is the stratum spinosum. The stratum spinosum is pretty thick. There are between 8 and 10 layers of cells. Specifically, remember, we call them keratinocytes. And these keratinocytes are strongly attached to each other with desmosomes. We already mentioned desmosomes. Remember, I said desmosomes are like little staples. They're like proteins that connect a cell to something. The specific ones I mentioned before were hemidesmosomes, or like half desmosomes. So let me explain what the difference is. A half desmosome or hemidesmosome attaches one cell to something. A desmosome is the full thing, right? It attaches 2 cells together. So each half of this will attach a cell. So when we look at the skin, I'm going to draw the epidermis really big so that we can see this, but here's my curvy line, right? My basement membrane. And I have basal cells on the bottom, and those basal cells divide and divide and divide, and they make more cells that they push up, right? And that gives us these keratinocytes that are up here in the stratum spinosum. we have multiple different types of desmosomes, of little proteins that are connecting the layers and the cells together. At the bottom here in the basal cells, we have hemidesmosomes. So that is like one little protein connector that connects the cell to the membrane below, right? Like that. That's a hemidesmosome because it's only connecting one cell to something. Now we have desmosomes up in the stratum spinosum. They're full desmosomes because they're connecting two cells to each other. So it has like the one part that comes to this cell, and then the other side goes and connects that cell. So it's like a staple that's holding two cells to each other. What this means, because these cells are connected by desmosomes, right, by these little protein staples, that means that the cells are very strongly attached to each other. Right? That's another thing that helps make the epidermis a really good barrier. The cells are packed in really closely, and they're held together with proteins so that they don't separate easily. These cells of the stratum spinosum are produced by the division of the stem cells in the stratum basale, right? Which, remember, were the basal cells. So the basal cells in the stratum basale divide and they push the cells up, and that creates the stratum spinosum. Now, the cells in the stratum spinosum can still divide. Okay, so they're still living, functioning cells, and they still have the ability to divide. Now, this is important because this continues to increase the thickness of the skin. Make sure that we have plenty of cells in there. In the stratum spinosum, it's mostly keratinocytes, but we do have another type of cell that we see going through the stratum spinosum, and this is called the dendritic cell, or also called Langerhans cells. Dendritic cells are cells that are part of the immune system, so they help to defend our body against infection. So what these dendritic cells do, or Langerhans cells, is they phagocytize, right? Which, remember, phagocytosis is cell eating. That's when the cell engulfs something. So these dendritic cells phagocytize, or engulf, or eat any pathogens that make their way past the superficial layers of the skin. So the skin is a really good barrier, but it's not perfect. Sometimes a pathogen, like pathogens are things like bacteria, fungus, viruses, just little organisms that can make us sick. That's what a pathogen is. So the skin's a great barrier, but sometimes pathogens that can make us sick can make it past these cells on the surface, right? Maybe you scratch yourself and the skin's open there, so things can get in. Now, these dendritic cells roam around the stratum spinosum looking for pathogens, and if they see it, they phagocytize it or eat it and get rid of it before it makes its way all the way into the body. Okay, hopefully that's the goal. Dendritic cells can also eat or get rid of superficial skin cancers before they cause problems. We actually have cells that turn cancerous much more frequently than anybody would ever think about. But our immune system kills them. It gets rid of the cells before they become active tumors. What else? Oh, the reason that we call this the stratum spinosum is because when the tissue gets like made into a slide that we can look at in the microscope, it gets dehydrated, right? So the fluid leaves and the cell starts to like shrink up a little bit, but because of the proteins that are in it, parts of the cell are like stuck out, they're held out, and then other parts shrivel. So it ends up looking like that. It looks kind of spiny. So spiny, spinosum, that's where the name came from, just FYI. I won't ask you that, but if you're curious, that's why that name is there. Okay, moving up again. We had the stratum basale, where we have stem cells, basal cells that just divide. We also have some melanocytes there making melanin. And then we move up and we have the stratum spinosum. The cells are really strongly attached to each other there in the stratum spinosum. And they keep dividing. So we keep making some more cells to keep the skin nice and thick in the stratum spinosum. Then moving up even further, we get to the stratum granulosum. It's called granulosum because there are granules. Okay, specifically granules of something called keratohyalin. Okay, which we'll talk about down here at the bottom. But stratum granulosum because the cells are packed with granules, these dense little packs of keratohyalin. Now, the stratum granulosum is 3 to 5 layers of keratinocytes. And those keratinocytes come from the stratum spinosum because remember, the cells just get pushed up and up and up and up. So the cells of the stratum basale are going to become the stratum spinosum. The cells of the stratum spinosum are going to become the granulosum. Okay. Now, in the stratum granulosum, the cells really start to change. This is when they kind of they stop becoming these living functioning cells and they're gonna start the process of dying essentially. So the cells stop dividing in the granulosum and they start producing very large amounts of keratin and keratohyalin. So what this keratohyalin does, again, they're these really dense granules, and they essentially promote the death of the cell. They promote dehydration of the cell, so the cell kind of dries out. The nucleus and most of the organelles, right, the little functional units in the cells are destroyed. Right, so essentially the cell is going to destroy all of its components and dry out. This keratohyalin also promotes aggregation and cross-linking of keratin fibers in neighboring cells. So, so if you have a cell here and a cell next to it, and they're both going to be filled with keratin, the keratin will actually cross-link from one cell into the next. Right? So this is another thing that kind of connects the cells together and makes the skin a really good barrier. Now, before the cell dies, it produces tons of keratin. Right? So these cells, we said they stop dividing and they start producing a ton of keratin and then keratohyalin. Keratin, you guys know, is this tough, strong, fibrous protein that makes the skin strong. It also makes the skin water resistant. So it's resistant to abrasion, so it doesn't tear very easy, and it's water resistant, so it's hard for water to cross. Right? So the cells produce a ton of keratin. The keratin cross-links between the cells like this. And then the nucleus, the organelles get destroyed, it's dehydrated, and essentially you just got a bunch of sacs of keratin. Okay. So I'm going to say, this is one of the reasons, the fact that the cells are connected by desmosomes, by proteins, and then you've got all of this keratin that's cross-linked between cells. This is why when your skin peels, it typically peels in sheaths. Right? All of these desmosomes, all of the cross-linked keratin connects the cells together really strongly. So even when they're dead, like when you get a sunburn and you damage that skin and then you slough it off from the body, you don't lose it one cell at a time, right? You can peel off actual large pieces of skin because the cells are so strongly attached to each other. So it's kind of cool. After the stratum granulosum is the stratum lucidum. Now remember, that's only if we're looking at thick skin. If it's thin skin, that won't be present. The stratum lucidum is just a layer of really densely packed cells that are full of keratin. Very, very densely packed together. And this layer is just important. It decreases the amount of friction or kind of like wear and tear on the cells and tissues below. Now that makes sense that this is present in the palms of the hands and the soles of the feet. Those are the two areas that get the most wear and tear, right? Our hands are our major tools. When we go to do something, we use our hands. So there's a lot of friction, and we don't want to damage, the muscles and tendons and tissue that's present in our hands. So this really dense layer of cells helps to protect the tissues underneath. And then our feet, well, obviously our feet are really stressed. We walk around on our feet all the time, so there's a lot of friction, a lot of pressure, a lot of wear and tear. So that layer of densely packed cells helps to protect the muscles underneath. Finally, the outermost layer of the skin is the stratum corneum. Again, this is the most superficial, exposed surface of the skin that you can see and feel and touch. It's composed of 15 to 30 layers of completely keratinized cells. Now, this would be in thin skin. Okay, thick skin can have over 100 layers of cells in the stratum corneum, so much thicker. Now, what we mean by keratinized cells, I have it on a slide coming up, but essentially keratinized just means that the cell is dead and packed with keratin. So the cells in the stratum corneum are literally just sacks of keratin. The cells in the stratum corneum are very tightly packed together, right? Very, very tightly packed together. They're water resistant because of the keratin, so that means it's really hard for water to get across them. And again, they still are connected by desmosomes. And I mentioned on the slide before, these are the reasons why your skin peels in sheets. On average, the entire stratum corneum will be lost and replaced every couple weeks. Now, obviously, we don't do this like snakes, right? It's not like every 2 weeks you shed all of your stratum corneum. Hopefully, that would be really gross. But you lose little bits at a time, right? Every time you shower, you dry off, you exfoliate, whatever, you lose little skin cells here and there. And then at the end of a couple weeks, chances are you will have completely replaced the stratum corneum. Now, I just mentioned keratinization, right? I said that the cells in the stratum corneum are completely keratinized. What I mean by that is that they are dead cells packed with keratin. So this process of keratinization is the process where we form this layer of dead protective cells, right, that are filled with keratin. So the formation of the stratum corneum. Keratinization occurs on all exposed skin surfaces except for the eyes. Now, by exposed skin surfaces, I mean outer skin surfaces, right? The epidermis. Inner surfaces, so like the mucosa in your mouth, for example, the mucosa in the vagina, for example, those are not keratinized, right? They are moist, mucousy membranes. They're not keratinized. But all of the epidermis on the outer portions of our body is keratinized, except for the eyes. This process of keratinization is essentially the skin's life cycle, right? The way that the cell changes from stem cell division in the stratum basale, right, all the way up to the death of the cell in the more superficial layers. It typically takes between 15 to 30 days for this process, for the cell to move from the stratum basale up to the stratum corneum. We'll finish today's lecture with just a quick kind of overview of perspiration. So perspiration is technically the loss of water across the epidermis. You probably think of it as sweating. So like when you get deodorant, it's deodorant and antiperspirant. The deodorant is the smell good part, the perfumey part. The antiperspirant is like anti-sweat. That's what stops the sweat from being released from the glands. So perspiration is sweating, right? Or losing what we think of as sweating, but it's technically losing water across the epidermis. And we actually lose water across the epidermis in a couple different ways. It's not just sweating or the production of sweat. So the first type of perspiration that I'll talk about is the easy one that we all understand, and that is sensible perspiration. Sensible perspiration is the water that's excreted by our sweat glands, right? This is to cool the body off. You can remember that this is sensible because you sense it, right? You know when you're dripping sweat, when you go to work out and you're really hot and you start sweating all over, you can sense that. You know that you're sweating, right? It's something you can feel. You can also remember it because it's sensible. It makes sense. There's a reason behind it. You're too hot, so your body is producing sweat to cool off. Makes perfect sense. It's sensible. Now, insensible perspiration is the water that we lose by evaporation. Okay, so interstitial fluid is just the fluid that surrounds our cells. So really the fluid that surrounds our cells, like down in the dermis and in the lower areas of the skin. Now, some of this water actually evaporates out through the epidermis and through the stratum corneum. And it's much more than you would think of. About 500 milliliters a day, which is 0.5 liters, right? Or half of a liter. Oops, L-I-T-E-R. Of water evaporates out of your body every day. That's a lot. Now you might think, why, right? We said that the stratum corneum is packed with keratin, and keratin is water resistant, so water doesn't cross it. But notice I said water resistant. It's not waterproof. So while the keratin helps to decrease the amount of water that evaporates, it's not perfect. And we do lose some water. Some water does simply evaporate out of us across that keratin, across the stratum corneum. That fluid that we lose by evaporation is insensible perspiration. Now again, you can remember that it's insensible because you don't sense it. You have never, I guarantee you, stopped and been like, man, I'm really evaporating today. Right? You don't know, hopefully, that's really super weird. You don't notice it, right? It happens without you realizing it. You can also say it's insensible because there's no sense behind it. There's no reason. Your body isn't intentionally evaporating. It doesn't have any purpose in you. It's insensible. Now, this 500 mLs a day is typical. That's what happens under normal circumstances. But there are things that can affect this. Any damage to the epidermis damages that layer of keratin, right? The layer of keratin has to be intact in order to try and slow down this evaporation. So if you damage that keratin, right, if you damage the epidermis, then you can allow much more fluid to evaporate. Now, there are small things that this can happen, like blisters, for example. Blisters are filled with liquid, right? So if you pop a blister, you lose some fluid, and then fluid tends to seep out of it more. Now, there are some conditions or some instances when people have a lot of blisters all over the body or all over a certain area. One little blister on your heel doesn't matter. But if the person has a lot of large blisters or abscesses, then they're going to lose a lot of fluid. They're going to have much more insensible perspiration. Burns. This is another really important thing in relation to insensible perspiration. When someone has burns over a large portion of their body, they have damaged the epidermis. It's no longer intact. And the person actually loses a ton of water. So dehydration via just evaporating fluid can cause really severe dehydration. So that's one of the important things in burn victims is, well, pain is a huge issue. Infection is a huge issue because you can't keep pathogens out anymore. And then dehydration is a huge issue because the water just evaporates. There's a big increase in insensible perspiration. Osmosis can actually affect the movement of water through the stratum corneum. So remember that inside the body is a solution, right? There's or suspension. There's a bunch of liquid with a bunch of stuff in it. And then if you put your body in water, then that's another solution. And water can either cross the stratum corneum into your skin, or it can leave out of your skin. So for example, if you are taking a bath, right? So you sit down in a hypotonic fresh water. You have your bathtub, and then you have you. And inside you is a solution with solutes, right? And now you're in this water that doesn't have any solutes. Remember, osmosis says that water will cross towards the side with more stuff. So if you sit in water, hypotonic water, for a long time, water is actually going to cross the stratum corneum, and it's going to accumulate in your skin underneath the stratum corneum. So that's what happens, and then you get little swollen areas. That's why you get prune fingers when you're in the water for a long time. This happens at the ocean as well because the ocean's less concentrated than your body is. But so you get little pruned fingers, right? It swells up in areas when you're in the water for a long time. The opposite could also happen if you put someone in water and it was very, 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 very highly concentrated, right? There was a ton of stuff. So you put someone in this really salty hypertonic solution. You could actually dehydrate them. You could actually like dry out the skin because the water would leave and go into the solution. Okay, not super important, but it can happen. All right, guys, that was it. This was a really long lecture. Sorry, I went like 3 minutes over on this one, but that is it. I will go ahead and post the second one tomorrow, which is Thursday, and then we'll be done with this chapter super fast. If you guys have any questions, go ahead and shoot me an email.